God of War 3 is more or less the perfect culmination of everything the previous two games laid out. In the first one, we established Kratos, learned about the world and this twisted version of Greek mythology. In the second one, we got to know the gods and titans as well as their history as we progressed towards Mount Olympus. Then here in the third, we finally get to the top and burn it all down, one god at a time. We pick up with the exact same scene that ended God of War 2, except the Blade of Olympus is now garbage and cannot be used regularly. It's the new replacement for your Titan Rage mode situation, and it's not a great one. But before you can even notice that, you'll likely be shooketh to your core by the quality of the graphics. The art style is super realistic, but still stylized enough that it fits well within the framework we're used to. It just looks like the pinnacle of this trilogy's evolution. Between the camera work, the incredible environmental design, the amount of definition everything has, they really nailed it. The remaster is almost on par with 2018, and though the HD cutscenes are gone, these in-engine scenes still look phenomenal. Also, keep in mind the last two were PlayStation 2 games, so this feels like an extra long leap forwards. If the first thing you notice is the visual upgrade, the second thing is likely going to be how improved combat feels. While mechanically very similar and holding on to the now familiar movesets we know and possibly even love, it adds an increased sense of weight and power. Everything feels chunkier, enemies are tankier, requiring much more punishment, and difficulty, at least where combat's concerned, is higher than ever. It's not just needless difficulty though, I kinda feel like in this case it mostly makes sense. We're fighting actual gods left and right, it probably shouldn't be a walk in the park. As usual, in defeating each of these beings essential to the survival of the planet, we get a brand new weapon or tool for almost every major encounter. I felt like except for the Hercules fists, which rule, they were all a bit too similar to each other. And while the Hades claws were neat and the electric whip was fine, I just stuck with the blades most of the time. Well, and the fists so I could pretend to be the American guy from G Gundam. The tools like Hermes' boots and this dude's bow and that same exact dude's severed head all work very similarly to how magic used to, except now with a regenerating meter. Not that anything's really been lost because we get spells tied into weapons now. Sorta like runic attacks in 2018 or like Ashes of War if you're nasty. These aren't customizable, but they are very powerful, and the one that summons a small Spartan phalanx is stylish but still functional. It's kinda like what cargo pants were in the 90s. The boss fights we go through to obtain these godly accoutrements are by far the most brutal in the entire series. They're typically a fun time, and like most of the gameplay in God of War 3, it's broken up well enough not to become tedious or annoying. They don't repeat the same gimmick too many times, so each fight feels fresh and different. Fighting Poseidon feels totally different than fighting Kronos, or the battle against Hades, or the time we battled Depression. The graphical upgrade also adds a bit to how visceral each encounter feels, but I'd say it's more the way each fight ends that I'll be remembering. Kratos always seems to find the most brutal way to disfigure his adversaries possible, and for where he's at narratively it works. It's downright gross on occasion, and I absolutely love it. It also actually helps to keep things sorta grounded in reality when they get too grand or spectacular. The word epic doesn't even come close to covering the sense of scale this game presents. For its time, it was larger and more daunting than anything else out there. In terms of both size and hype, there are moments in here still unsurpassed in most of the series. Backgrounds that are much more than just set dressing, moving parts of actual giant 3D Titan models we ride on the limbs of. We see massive sprawling destruction as an immediate consequence of our face-mashing ways. In a new and not so new occurrence, each god you kill ceases to govern their respective domain, and the world is permanently changed. Sort of like how when Ares exploded into a nuke and Athena became the green wind stuff, in this game when you kill the god of the seas, the entire world's oceans become an apocalyptic flood. Classic. And when you decapitate Helios the rudest way possible, the sun is blotted out from the sky. Hades releases all the souls of the underworld. Hermes seems to release insects or maybe disease. I think that's just because of the caduceus, Hermes or Mercury's staff, and its use in a medical context, but I have no idea. I loved how dramatic and serious the killing of each god is taken and how severely they impact the world around them in their passing. It makes them seem more like natural, primordial forces we happen to be destroying, which in any other situation would be terrible, but we're basically a villain at this point and who cares. One death I took particular interest in, despite its not unleashing a plague, was Hercules. Only instead of making an impact on the world, we make an impact on his face. The gruesome aspect isn't what I find interesting, just his place in the third game after other comparable heroes like Theseus and Perseus. Kratos is, after all, most similar to Hercules. He does steal many of his great feats from myth, like the killing of the Hydra and Cerberus says. He also borrows a lot of Hercules' backstory, like the whole killing his family and then dying to ascend to godhood thing. So I kinda felt weird when we pulverized the man and swam over his corpse. This version is perhaps the most aggressive and most asshole Kratos has the capacity to be as a human. Even if people aren't in his way, he often needs to kill them. And not just that lady he shoved under the gear to prop the door open, I'm talking anybody and everybody. I'd say he does show some compassion towards Pandora and his family in the Shadow Realm, but there are few if any shades of the man we know he becomes. Not yet. This game is still pretty fully pointed towards uber violence and over sexualization. I would argue, however, that this era of God of War was sorta defined by hedonism and revenge, so it doesn't feel out of place in the trilogy. Everything, in fact, down to the pacing, feels like an excellent cap on an amazing series. It's all just fun, no real filler to speak of. Flying sections are still here, but they're not too bad or easy to fail on normal difficulty. QuickTime events are still abound, but they're easier due to button prompts taking up their own respective side of the screen. The whole thing just feels more playable. It's a short but thrilling journey to the end, not just for the Greek mythology era, but this iteration of God of War as a series. Each of the game's directors brought something unique and different to the table, each improving upon the last's creation. From Stig, the Jedi Fallen Order guy with the difficult last name, then Cory Balrog, that beautiful optimistic man-peach, all the way back to David Jaffe, whose idea this was all born from. I am a huge fan of what the franchise turned into. It grew up with me and matured into one of my favorite modern duologies. I wouldn't trade that for anything, but I'm also a fan of what it used to be. This style of game is dead, and maybe some of it had to die, but not all of it. You could say the hack and slash genre is still alive and well with games like DMC5, another modern masterpiece, or the Bayonetta trilogy, but God of War was something unique in the landscape that just doesn't really exist anymore. Playing through all three of these games back to back like this reminded me of that, and I miss it. Whatever it is. The God of War trilogy is one I'm very glad to have played, and I'd still recommend all three if you're willing to be a tad frustrated and work through a little 2005 platforming. It gave me a renewed perspective on one of gaming's most iconic and interesting characters. It reminded me of a time games could be completed in 10 hours, and the whole treating Greek gods as killable living creatures thing is just cool. Without a doubt, 3 was my personal favorite. It felt like a real crescendo built from all the different pieces of the first two games, and it ends the Greek storyline beautifully. I think it's a fantastic game that holds up very well for the most part, and it doesn't betray the spirit of what came before. And after all this, if there's one thing I know for sure about Kratos going forward, it's that his god-killing days are behind him. Right, guys? Guys?